Hi. When I had finished last video, the introduction to the Sermon on the Plain, which is normally seen as Luke 6:20 to 49, I thought we'd start this video with the Beatitudes and just jump right into it. But in spending some time with the verses you see on the left side of the screen and then in the frame on the right side of the screen, 6, 17, and 19, I realized there's so much going on in these verses that we should probably just focus on them. And really they serve as a prologue to the Sermon on the Plain. So we tend to think of it starting in verse 20, as you can see. Then he looked up at the disciples and said, as the start. But what we saw before this was the call of the disciples. Jesus had gone off to pray and called the disciples, and then he came down with them and stood on the level place, as you see in verse 17. So there's a lot going on in these three verses worth our attention before we get to the words of Jesus. So let's just jump in right here. He came down with them and stood on a level place. The phrase for level place, tapu pedinos, here is otherwise used in the Septuagint for the Shephelah, the low-lying plain but below the central mountain range in Palestine. And as you can see from the screenshot from Google Maps, we can see all the references in this verse here. So let's finish the verse and we'll look at that at the same time. With a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. So much going on here. So if the level place in readers' minds, at least people familiar with Palestine in the first century, think of the Shephelah, one who is also a Septuagint reader might consider texts like Isaiah 40 and all the other places where Luke is calling upon Jubilee echoes. In fact, we've heard that already earlier at Luke 3:4-5, which we can recall right here, as we heard from John the Witness. As it is written in the book of the words of the prophet Isaiah, this is actually the narrator speaking here, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Every valley shall be filled, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. The crooked shall be made straight, and the rough ways made smooth. In other words, part of the image of Jubilee, echoing from Isaiah's great call to come out of Babylonian exile and walk the 700-mile path back to where Jerusalem had been and engage in the process of restoring it all in the name of Yahweh, is all echoed here. Echoed in the beginning of Luke at the call for repentance and metanoia that we saw with the coming of John the Baptist in the anticipation of the coming of Jesus. So the image of the level place is one that we ought to hear echoed into the entire Jubilee theme of Luke. And of course it contrasts, as we saw briefly last time, and we'll look at more next time, in how Luke and Mark take this tradition and work it their own way, with Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, which is his way of echoing Jesus as a new Moses. And that's key to how Matthew presents Moses for what's almost certainly a Jewish audience. But Luke, writing for what we assume is an audience of non-Jews, of people in the young adult stage of being formed in Greco-Roman paideia to take their place as leaders in the Greco-Roman world, Luke is trying to get them to hear that Jesus' way is the way that leads to peace and joy for all people, more than the Roman way. And that links to what we saw last time as the two cultural contexts we're looking at, and the authors we looked at last time, Louis Nadeka and Julia Vandenbrink, who offered us two different entry points, and as my video last time suggested, we're going to look at them both. And so this echoes here into the geography of the time, but it also will echo into some of the Hebrew scripture echoes that we'll see. So, the great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. So a couple of things here. A great crowd of his disciples. Where did they come from? This phrase is only here in the New Testament, and as my note below says, usually, quote-unquote, crowd is a group separate from disciples. And so now there's a great crowd of disciples. And as we saw with the call of 12 to be apostles a couple of videos ago, only Luke among the evangelists presents the disciples as a large group, as opposed to the 12 who in Matthew equate to the 12 apostles. So Luke shows us an increasingly large crowd of people who've committed to Jesus, and beyond that, a great multitude of people, or we can translate it a little differently, the fullness of many people, plethos here, the word for fullness, as opposed to the crowd, from all these different places. So the word for people here, laos, is often the word used in the Septuagint for the people of God, the people of Israel. Note that it's the same as the existing country country in Southeast Asia of that name, which is to say that the colonizers named that geographic land they put a boundary on the people, even though the people in Laos, the country of Laos, consist of many different ethnic groups. And I mentioned that function of empire geography because that's very important to what's going to follow in the role of the Romans in doing the same thing with these places that are now named. So all Judea and Jerusalem, and Luke often distinguishes Jerusalem from Judea, and as some scholars have suggested, he sometimes, but not always, uses Judea to refer to what we would refer to all of Palestine, which is to say to include Galilee in the north and Samaria in the central area, as you can see on this map. So all Judea and Jerusalem, who we've seen before, they came early on in 222, and then of course Jesus was in Jerusalem there, and shockingly from the coast of Tyre and Sidon, which again you can see on the map here. But Tyre and Sidon traditionally, as representative of the Phoenician Empire, the two maritime cities that controlled much of the Mediterranean in the time before the Greeks and the Romans, especially in the time of early Israel monarchy, all the way to the Straits of Gibraltar on the edge of Spain there. And so these cities as symbols of previous empires, often addressed by the prophets, are now coming to Jesus. And we could ask many questions about that, although they're unanswerable, like how do they know? How could the word of Jesus spread that far so quickly? And if we just read verse 17, we don't know why they've come, although verse 18 will explain it in a moment, and we'll get there in a second. So there's suddenly this huge crowd of two groups of people, of disciples who at this point seem to be probably people from the people of Israel. We have no reason to think he's including other people already, and yet now it's expanding, anticipating what we're going to see in Acts, that the message is going to go out to all the peoples of the earth. And so all these people gather, and then we hear this in verse 18 of why they came, and it's worth looking at very carefully. They had come to hear him, and so recalling 5:15, and we'll look at that comparison in a second, and to be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. So they came to hear and to be healed of their diseases. I'm going to look at that language more closely in just a second, but as you can see on the right side of the screen, the verses we're looking at now echo very closely what we saw in chapter 5 in verses 15 to 17. After the first call of the disciples, and then as Jesus begins his ministry out in the world. And so let's look at that briefly, and you can see I've color-coded it so you can see the parallels here. And they're not only parallel in these places, but some of these words are not used very, very often elsewhere in Luke. So there's clearly a parallel here. And I want to draw attention to a couple of bits of language here. How they both use therapeuo, the root verb here to be cured, and we see that here. And both use aiomai here in its two different forms to be healed. And the New RSV helps us by translating those consistently, first as cured and then as healed. And we're going to look at that more closely. But an also important difference is the word for diseases in our current passage, nason, is different than asthenion here in verse 5:15, which more generally means weakness. So we're going to have to look at that more closely. So let's return to our verse here and see how that goes. The word for disease here, noson, is used earlier in Luke. Let's look at that briefly, just the first one. In 4:40 we saw, as the sun was setting, all those who were sick with various kinds of diseases brought them to him, and he laid his hands on each of them and cured them. So again, the word for diseases here is nosois, the same word. And that word, I like to refer to it as Egypt disease. And here are three examples from Hebrew scripture that highlight this. So here from Exodus 15:26, Moses speaking. He said, "If you will listen carefully to the voice of Yahweh your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give heed to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will not bring upon you any of the diseases I brought upon the Egyptians, for I am Yahweh who heals you." And similarly, we hear these two passages from Deuteronomy, this from 7:15. "Yahweh will turn away from you every illness, all the dread diseases of Egypt that you experienced. He will not inflict on you, but he will lay them on all who hate you." But in sharp contrast, near the end of Deuteronomy, in chapter 28, verse 60, we hear this: "He will bring back upon you all the diseases of Egypt, of which you were in dread, and they shall cling to you." And the reason for that contrast between Deuteronomy 7, where Yahweh promises to turn away from you the dread diseases of Egypt, and then in 28 to return them, has to do with what we saw last time, and I was pointing out here in Vandenbrink's invitation to read this current passage and the entire Sermon on the Plain in terms of covenant blessings and curses. And sure enough, Deuteronomy 28 is one of the ones that she refers to there. So In addition to the echo there from Deuteronomy and from Exodus, I'd like to focus on what the use of noson as diseases is pointing out, and especially as in this threefold explicit connection to Egypt. Not only in Exodus, where it says the diseases I brought upon the Egyptians, but in Deuteronomy both times the diseases of Egypt, diseases unique to Egypt. And I'd like to suggest that include a number of things. First of all, the various environmental diseases that come from Egypt's, as described in Exodus, being out of harmony with creation, the way empires do, using slavery and forced irrigation to make the earth bring forth food. And of course, in the Exodus story, that brings forth a series of plagues. But as many writers have said, in our ecological moment that we're in, with climate change and species loss and so many other things that flow from bad human practices, human choices economically and politically affect the earth, and then that effect on the earth makes people sick. Whether that's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when people were crowded into cities in bad conditions and got waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid, or whether it's the kind of diseases that we might be experiencing in our world today, the kind of anxiety and depression that comes from a world out of control where people's hope for the future is vague at best, and the question of the present is frightening. So the kinds of categories we might distinguish between spiritual illnesses or mental illnesses or physical illnesses are unknown to the Bible, which simply sees humans as an integrated whole consisting of earth stuff and God's Spirit as we see in Genesis. Much different than the Platonic Greek intellectual view you see of a invisible soul inside a body where the flesh is part of the problem. The biblical view is nothing like the Greek view that way, but sees humans as a consistent, integrated whole. At least we're intended to be that way. That's the meaning of shalom, when humans, or any system, an ecological system as well, is operating in mutual harmony with each other. So we don't need to make distinctions, and we shouldn't make distinctions between mental illness or spiritual illness that we might consider in these next words here, being troubled with unclean spirits, and physical illnesses. These are all what I would call empire disease. Not to say that all diseases are empire disease. Plainly, there are many reasons why many people get sick, apart from the oppression of empire. But the language we'll see here, and what we'll continue to see in healing in Luke, really highlights it. The people that Jesus is liberating, the people who are coming there, aren't just people with colds or ordinary diseases, but are being oppressed by empire. And the language here underscores it, because the word for troubled here, hoi enaklomenoi, is a substantive meaning, those who are in this category. And as the Lolita lexicon says, the word means to cause hardship by continual annoyance. So we saw earlier two stories of unclean spirits. We saw at least the reference to them earlier, and then we saw this one here when the people were amazed. With authority and power, he commands unclean spirits and they come out. And we'll see later similar things in chapter 8 and 9 and 11. In fact, the only time that Luke uses the word for unclean, akathartos, here is in relation to spirits. And in the previous one, the emphasis was on the voice of the Spirit who knew Jesus, and Jesus silences it. But here, these are people who know that they are troubled by unclean spirits and are seeking to be relieved of that. And it says that Jesus will cure them, as we'll see. And so, further, all the crowd were trying to touch him. And we need to picture this here to make some sense of this. This whole multitude of disciples and a crowd from all these places, and they're all trying to touch Jesus. It's really quite a poignant scene. We're all reaching out, and obviously one person can't be touched by huge crowds, but that's their desire. And the word for touch, you can see, is used a number of times, and it plays into the different ways that Jesus heals. And so I've shown this chart before. It's posted on the webpage, and you can see this is one of several examples of Jesus touching by healing. Not the only way he can heal, but certainly one way that he does that there. And then it tells us that power came out from him and healed all of them. And the image of power coming out from him will echo again here to 8:46, when this woman who with the flow of blood comes up to Jesus, and we hear him say, "Someone touched me, for I noticed that power had gone out from me." So this is the first time we hear that there's something that Jesus has that's transmissible. It's the opposite of a virus. Instead of something coming out of Jesus that makes people sick, there's something coming out of Jesus that makes people well and that heals them. And I'm not going to try to answer the question of what is that something, other than to say the power of God and the power of the Holy Spirit. But Luke is portraying it like it's a real force, like there's this power, this energy in Jesus that comes out from him when people touch him. And we've not seen that before, but as I just showed you, we'll see it again. And it said it healed all of them. So Whether this is happening while he speaks or before he speaks or while he's there after he speaks isn't named, but the way it's given to us is this has all happened before he speaks. The then in verse 20 certainly seemed to suggest a temporal sequence here between the crowd trying to touch him and him healing them, and then they're coming to him to speak, to listen to him speak. So their second desire to be healed seems to happen first, and now they can hear him. And we'll see how this introduction echoes into the very end of the Sermon on the Plain, where he gives analogies to those who are going to be the good disciples who bear good fruit, as those who come to him and hear him. And so it's really important that we hear that these opening verses, 6, 17, and 19, really frame the Sermon on the Plain and helps us hear who's there and what they're looking for and what the audience might hear as good news when they hear it. And we'll continue with that next time with the Beatitudes. See you then. Bye-bye.